This is a book called Manifest Destiny: Democracy as Cognitive Dissonance. This whole intro is it's a playoff of Orwell's 1984. What does doublethink do to humanity and humanity's future? These are serious questions that should be pondered, but half the audience can't reason anymore. So, and I have here an artifact from Quigley's own typewriter with some of Quigley's own notes on it. But if you remove
epistemology is just a theory of knowledge. How do we know what exists?
Right.
The theory of knowledge.
And the removal of epistemology and the adoption of semantics leads to doublethink.
It leads us in a sort of language game, which is what postmodern is. And then that creates a sort of doublethink where there's cognitive dissonance and contradictions that don't relate to reality.
He identified in 1950 says that by 2050, we would have the world that we have today already. The 19th century felt that man was innately good, and that his occasional evil in his actions arose from the oppression of bad institutions and the frustration of man's instincts by such institutions. The disasters have experienced that we have experienced since 1929, so he's talking about the Great Depression and World War II, have undermined these beliefs so completely that they have largely been abandoned or in danger of being replaced in a natural reaction by belief in their opposites. The doublethink of 1984 is the semantics of 1945 grown up.
Wow.
Right? He's saying this is what he's projecting into the future. If we keep doing what we're doing now, changing the culture, changing the meaning of words to have control, this is what it's going to look like. Semantics holds that the meanings of words are fluid and can change as one uses them. So doublethink goes further than semantics merely because it is sophisticated enough to realize that it is possible to change reality by changing the content of words. This is the explanation of the party slogan in 1984. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. It is also evident in the party slogans. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Wait a minute. Isn't that what Manifest Destiny was pointing out with F. William Engdahl? War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. There must be some sort of historical lesson to be learned here.
Yeah.
This Christian ideology worked out a philosophy of three parts: logic connected with rules of thought, metaphysics concerned with the nature of reality, and epistemology concerned with the relationships between the two. Right. In this system, the logic was clear and rigid, and the necessary adjustments between thought and reality were made in the epistemology. A sharp distinction was made between validity and truth.
That's 100% true. You can have a valid argument that's completely false. That's exactly right.
Logic gave validity to a conclusion if its rules were obeyed, but this conclusion was not necessarily true. That was something to be tested according to the rules of epistemology.
That's exactly right.
Truth rested in reality, metaphysics, and not necessarily in the mind.
Right.
When Aquinas said, quote, nothing exists in the intelligence which was not first in the senses, end quote, and added, quote, it is not possible to transfer from the ideal to the actual, end quote, he at once destroyed the ancient rationalistic dualism and established the real basis of modern science.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So then he goes through and he says, here's what's going on and here's what happened, and it's starting to balance out.
Oh, yeah.
And
I'm holding myself back from getting into that history because I know all about it. So.
Sure. Up here on page 7, the new rationalistic dualism provides the third link in our chain. According to its assumptions, idea and actuality existed in opposed parallelism. This is the parallelism of the subjective and objective world. It was assumed that the objective world was rational and logical, and that its nature could be found by logical, that is, mathematical processes alone. This belief is the basis of the whole system of Descartes and of Newton, and thus the basic of the whole modern as opposed to contemporary ideology. Since the objective world is not logical or rational, life for these modern rationalists became a bitter and disillusioning experience.
That's exactly right. Descartes was one of the founders of that sort of it's called rationalism and epistemology. And during sort of the late medieval, early modern period, he came up with the most famous argument, I think, therefore I am. And he conducted all these thought experiments, the most famous being his Descartes' demon. If anyone wants to get into the absurdity of the ad ignorantium fallacy, there it is, the appeal to ignorance.
I am, therefore I think. And I study reality to get better results from my actions. Anyway,
he created unnecessary dualism. That's exactly right.
So it creates disillusionment and nihilism. And from this disillusionment came three divergent developments. Now, this is important.
Yes.
Skepticism, empiricism, and semantics.
I would actually correct.
I'm just reading his article, dude.
Yep,
This is his essay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
All three were reactions to the discovery that reason cannot by logic alone find actuality, since actuality is not necessarily logical or rational. Epistemology was the keystone of the arch. It was the key to science, to reality, and to sanity, because it was the connecting link between thought and the external world.
Because that's where every single philosopher attacks the ability to know truth, to define validity, define truth, to understand the process by which we do that. That's what they attack. That's what the past 500 years has been nothing more than an attack on man's sense perception, and then our ability to form concepts and to communicate the truth of something through language by understanding universals.
If these two lines converge, it may be possible to save what is really the core of Western Christian tradition: the belief that truth exists as a fact beyond the reach of whim or propaganda, and that sanity and the good life can be obtained by the struggle to find that truth and cling to it. But this possibility is menaced by the terrible threat of semantics. Yes. So, right, we have this good thing. Let's be optimistic. Let's use reason and logic and our power to use our 5 common senses to find that which exists and talk about it and make our lives stable. And he's saying, hey, semantics can make your life real unstable. And here's how. Semantics, like skepticism and empiricism, is a direct consequence of the disappearance of epistemology and the subsequent discovery of the inadequacy of rationalism. The rationalists believed that truth could be found by the use of reason and logic alone, because they had assumed that the world was rational and logical. Because the
That's
world
so
is
circular. Oh
I know.
My God.
Because the world is not rational or logical, they had failed. The skeptics accordingly doubted the capacity of the mind to know. The empiricists rejected the use of reason and tried to deal with the world beyond by the senses alone. The semanticists tried to deal with the world by bringing its lack of logic and rationality into the mind itself.
What's essentially he's saying there is that the empiricists rejected the use of reason and tried to deal with the world by the senses alone. That's true, because what they also rejected was the ability for human beings to conceive, to form a concept and communicate in language.
Free will, consciousness,
knowledge began
soul,
and
spirit,
ended in
all
the
those
senses.
Things are denied by them.
Right. That's the David Hume legacy. He's the ultimate empiricist. Knowledge began and ended in the senses. Essentially what he did was relegate us to nothing more than a newborn baby that is getting nothing but a bombardment of sensation that can't make sense of it. And so that's the empiricist way. The rationalists, the other way, are just trapped in their mind, because how do you start with not experience? How do you consciousness is being aware of something. So you have to have some sort of a priori categories that happen before existence for you to deduce the constituent of the universe. How do you have that? They don't go in that process. I mean, at least the Platonists tried to make a good argument for where that comes from. Descartes offers none. So this is just a mess.
Like an episode of Bizarro Father Knows Best, these people who consider themselves our betters are changing the world, not because they understand how we built the world in the past and they've improved upon it, but quite the opposite. They just take the rules of building and they're like, we don't need those anymore. So the disappearance of epistemology is the connection of human beings to objective reality, which is like group sanity. So if you have what's that mass syndrome they're talking about, Tony? Mass
formation.
Yeah, mass formation. I bet the disappearance of epistemology could be the root cause of that. We should look into that. But I want to bring this point. The skeptics accordingly doubted that the capacity of the mind to know, right? We went into that part. Well, they changed everything around, not by rediscovering the rules of epistemology, but just by changing the rules of logic, Tony.
Yeah,
it's so much simpler.
Logic. That's what's called symbolic logic. We've read it on a number of times on the show, but that's Albert North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell. That's Bertrand Russell's
all the way
great
through Wittgenstein.
Principia Mathematica.
Right. So to them, the old logic, Aristotelian logic, as they called it, was the source of all modern confusion, error, frustration, and insanity. Says people who don't build the infrastructure of this world.
So they deny the systematic understanding, the scientific conceptual understanding of how the mind works. They don't know how to build. That's all Aristotle essentially provided.
Or airplanes with that mentality. I could tell you that. Enough. To them, it was old. So they tried to replace it with non-Aristotelian logic, whose basic innovation was that it rejected the principle of contradiction.
Yeah, that's right.
The abandoning of this principle, which they called either or principle, meant that they had rejected all rigid categories or definitions. Oh, anything fluid these days because they reject all rigid categories? right? Either or, that's binary, by the way, right? So he calls it out. If you take away the ability for people to recognize contradictions, whatever Big Brother says today is what's going on. And that allows doublethink. So he's getting to not only the root cause of what's going on today, right? But he's getting to the root cause of doublethink, which is precipitating in our culture today. Their arguments for doing this, always based on persuasive everyday evidence, were convincing to those who had never heard of epistemology. I'll bet. If Aristotelian logic says, quote, male is not female and vice versa, end quote, the semanticist says, quote, what about homosexuals, end quote, and we are expected to give up Aristotelian logic. Such arguments are persuasive. But as a matter of fact, the semanticist art analysis is mistaken both in its diagnosis and in its remedy. Our errors do not arise from mistakes of Aristotelian logic, but from the loss of epistemology as an intellectual discipline. Moreover, Aristotelian logic is not mistaken when it fails to reflect the characteristics of actuality because it was never intended to do so, and neither Aristotle nor Aquinas was so naive or stupid to believe it did. The rules of Aristotelian logic applied to the conceptual world to the ideal proportion of reality and could be applied to the physical world, space-time, only by undergoing the rules of epistemology. As long as the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition insisted that the ideal is not the same as the actual, we are protected from doublethink.
That's right.
But once the semanticists can make us believe that the ideal must be at the same time as the actual, we are wide open to doublethink.
No.
Is this going on today? I mean, this guy wrote this in 1950. That's 80 years ago, right? 82 years ago?
All right.
The contrast between the two had nothing to do with our modern contrast between subjective and objective, since, for example, the rules of mathematics were ideal, but still objective truth, quite independent of any thinking human mind. The efforts of the semanticists to bring the variety of reality into the mind makes it necessary for them to abandon the Aristotelian scholastic belief that concepts are rigid and fixed, and to adopt in its place what they sometimes call multi-ordinal terms. Ooh. According to their belief, every word has an infinite number of meanings since the meaning varies with the context, and there are infinite number of contexts. The is of identity is rejected as impossible. There is no identity of fact in, in actuality. And each fact exists in actuality in a different relationship to its surroundings and context. Just as semantics is one of the logical results from the abandonment of epistemology, so Orwell's doublethink is one of the logical results of semantics. According to Orwell, the vocabulary of doublethink has two meanings. One meaning when it is applied to an enemy, and the opposite meaning when applied to a friend. Black-white is such an expression. That sounds like a popular topic in the last 10 years. Applied to an enemy, it means that he is such a degraded scoundrel that he would be willing to say that black is white. Applied to a friend, it means that his loyalty exceeds all logic or reality to the point where he would be willing to accept black as white. In the Oceania of 1984, the propaganda ministry which deluges the people with lies is called the Ministry of Truth. The ministry which wages war is called the Ministry of Peace. The economic agency whose chief task is to curtail production and ration artificially created scarcity is called the Ministry of Plenty. Freedom is called slavery, and slavery is called freedom. We do not have to wait until 1984 to see the approaching shadow of this ill-begotten child of semantics. Already, the prophets of the political right and the political left are making use of doublethink. We are told that in an election in the United States or England or Italy, for example, of brutal class oppression, while in Poland, elections, Russia or Bulgaria, it is an exercise in free democracy. Well, that's kind of like they applied something over there, but it's not okay over here, right? That type of doublethink. We're living in that now. He wrote about it back in 1950 very accurately. People like James Burnham tell us that the situation now existing between the United States and Russia is war, and that the only way to establish peace is to make immediate military assault on Russia. That's doublethink. He's calling it out. So it goes a couple more. The final link in our chain, the newspeak, which Orwell envisions for 2050, is perhaps hypothetical, but again is a logical development of doublespeak, doublethink, and semantics. If words have no fixed meaning, that's semantics, and then the meanings can be changed for political and propaganda purposes, that's doublethink, and ultimately people can be kept in complete intellectual subjection by being deprived of all words which refer to politically unacceptable ideas. Politically unacceptable ideas. That's newspeak. 1950.
The control of language is the control of the mind, and the control of language is fundamentally the control of reality. Because the way we understand language is by forming concepts and applying terms to them. In other words, words, in order to communicate with other individuals. So when you're able to do away with reality by assuming that human beings don't have the perceptual capacity to actually experience our world and to form concepts so then we can communicate and try to see if we can correspond what we're experiencing with other people to sort of verify our experiences. Yeah, we're sort of caught in a situation where whoever says whatever and they have the power, people over time end up believing it.